crescendo on the tom. And again, it was a very brief moment where they were the loudest, where they peaked. But at that moment, I made sure that at that little section, at that little piece, that everything else was kind of behind the scenes. I know that the next part comes in pretty quickly, so it may not seem as though the toms are that loud, but they're hitting pretty hard. And there's like this little swell and synth sound that kind of slide into the next portion. But at that moment, I purposely brought everything below the toms so that the toms would actually cut through. And because I have the tom reaching probably close to 0 dB, that is the main thing driving the volume right there. And I'm right at the edge of the volume, but the toms are just blasting through. And it makes it seem very, very loud. All right, so next thing here, let's move on to the next section here. Again, the synth is the main feature. The synths are a bit different for the second section, but they are the main feature. The secondary instrument or the secondary sound that I want to have in prominence or out in front of the listener is the snare drum hit. All right, so let me start just before that tom swell and listen for the main synth and listen for the snare drum. So as I mentioned, the snare and the synth, they are all in your face. Mind you, in this song, I have electric guitar panned out there. I have like this little building sound in the back, like the sound that's kind of climbing up in pitch. All that stuff is there, but the thing that's right in your face is the snare and the synth. Again, as you create your different sections in your song, figure out what you want to have come to prominence or what you want to be the prominent player at any given time. If you do this, you can actually push your overall volume to the very edge and make the listener feel that it is really just blasting in their face. And you kind of create the narrative there with the sound. You tell the listener, focus on this part of the song. And that's exactly what I'm doing by way of choosing very specific instrumentation to play the key role at different times. All right, let me say one more thing about this here, and I want to move on to my next point that's related to what I just talked about. I've heard this in a lot of popular music. I challenge you, go back and listen to most of your artists that you follow. I almost with certainty can guarantee you that if you listen to commercially released music, you will find that this technique is used a lot, even above vocals. I was listening to a track the other day, and as I was listening to it, I'm like, you know what? That 808, that snare is actually louder than the actual vocalist or the rapper or the singer or what have you. Sure, I understand for the, you audiophiles that some of those instruments I just mentioned occupy a different area on the EQ, but I'm just saying, just in terms of energy, I've noticed that in many popular songs, at certain points when there's like a guitar solo or synth part that's supposed to be prominent, but there's vocals, the vocals drop back. Again, do your own homework. You may not understand the point that I'm making right now until you go back, listen to a commercially released song, and do this homework. Go back and see what stands out as the main sound at any given point. You will start to see a major, major pattern out there. And that is what we just talked about today. Choosing 1, 2, at the most 3 things that will be prominent. The other stuff can be there, but those prominent instruments, they are pushed to the limit to create that loudness for any given section. All right, let's move on to my next point here. And this relates to what I just talked about. I want to talk about a concept here called sidechain compression. Sidechain compression. All of us most likely work with different digital audio workstations. So the concept of sidechain compression may be very different in terms of how it's carried out from my DAW to your setup or what have you. I want to just talk about the concept overall and just play an example of how I used sidechain compression today in my mix. So let me put this in my terms here. And I know that I'm not going to make it ultra technical, just kind of take the layman's version of it. And I believe it's accurate. Sidechain compression is basically when you have two tracks, two buses, or two sound sources in your digital audio workstation. And with those two relative to one another, you would cause one to go lower given the energy of the other one. So for instance, and let me make this a little bit plainer here. For my example here, my audio clip that I've been playing, I have caused my synth to go a little lower when my snare drum hits. Now, unless you have some super amazing ninja ear, you probably did not detect that today. But that's what's happening. So I mentioned that I had my two prominent instruments, right? My synth and my snare drum. Well, specifically, I wanted my snare never, ever, ever to lose its power. I wanted that thing to blast my overall volume right up there near 0 decibels. And I didn't want anything pulling away from that or watering that sound or that energy down. As a result, I use sidechain compression between those two tracks, my snare and my synth, to have my synth slightly move down, or we call it ducking. You heard the term before, to duck my snare. So it's like, hey, my snare is coming in, it's swinging hard. Just duck, just move out the way. And then when it's done, you come back. But it's happening so subtly, you probably don't notice it. Let me play it one more time. Here we go. If I were to allow my synth to blast full volume and my snare to blast full volume, when the snare hits and the synth is on, that energy together would have taken my track over the limit potentially. I'm over 0 decibels. So that's something that we don't want to do. We're outside of the room that's allotted for what we're doing at that point. But let's say, I brought my volume and adjusted my gains to the point where I didn't go over my 0 decibels. Well, my problem is that, as I mentioned a second ago, that synth, when the snare hits, would rob the snare of its energy. So as a result, again, I use side chain compression. Let me go a bit further into this to really drive home the point, especially for those of you who may be new to side chain compression. And if you're new to it, after I go through my next little example here, you're going to recognize this technique very, very clearly because it's being used everywhere in a lot of digital dance type of music. It has been for quite a while. I'm going to isolate the synth and the snare. I still think it's kind of hard to hear. On my screen, I can tell that the volume is being reduced by a few decibels each time my snare hits. So the synth is being reduced very quickly with each tap of the snare. So let me exaggerate what's going on here with the side chain to overemphasize the point. And when I do this, quite frankly, you're going to recognize a sound that we hear a lot in digital music. Let me play it for you. You hear that? It's like this pulsing type of sound. All right, let me play it one more time. I'm going to remove the snare, but I'm going to keep the energy that's being sent behind the scenes to the synth to cause the synth to duck and listen to it. And again, I've used some pretty harsh numbers on my compression to make the point. So it will sound a little scratchy, but listen to it as it ducks around the snare. You're not going to hear the snare, but just trust that the pulses from the snare, they're happening in an inaudible way. Take a listen. Okay. All right, and again, it sounds a little scratchy because I compress the life out of that thing like to a crazy degree. But the point is, I wanted you to hear what's happening. And I'm sure you've heard that type of sound before, that pulsing sound. That is called ducking, and that can be accomplished using sidechain compression. Just check it out online, especially for your digital audio workstation. You probably can find some free plugins, or you may already have some native plugins that you can use sidechain compression with. So yeah, just Google it, check it out. Your sound will go a long way. All right, and for the last point here, I want to talk about sound illusion again, or the perception of sound. The previous points that I just made have to do with actual real loudness, getting up to 0 dB, having instruments, maybe 2 instruments or 2 sounds that are really just pushing just the edge of that, the window, your audio window, or that space, if you will. The next point is going to be, again, more about the perception of sound, similar to what we talked about in our previous episode. And I believe one good way of creating a perception that your song is getting bigger and louder is to utilize sounds that have what I would call more of a climbing type of essence to them, or a building type of essence. And specifically in the background here, I'm using this pitched percussion sound, and behind the scenes is building from a low pitch to a high pitch, but it makes it feel as though the song is getting more and more intense. And for those who may not be musically adept, they may feel that the song is getting louder, where this pitched sound is building or climbing up the scale, or climbing up chromatically, or what have you. Let me play it for you one more time. Listen for this pitched sound, this percussion sound that's slowly building in the background. When I say building, I mean building in pitch, going from low to high. Did you hear that? It's super low and subtle, but let me play it for you. Here we go. That's the sound. And you guys have probably heard this in different tracks. It could be a synth that's climbing up, or it can be some kind of crazy sound that's being pitched up. Sometimes there's like a vocal sample, and then someone will just kind of keep pitching it up, like by, semitones, or it can even be like, microtones, and it's kind of just climbing up. It just creates the perception of energy, and that things are building and building and building. Volume wise, the volume technically in my track right here, it's pretty much consistent after we get through that tom-tom build. But that little climbing sound, and mind you, it's way, way back in the mix. It's not even out front. But again, the perception of loudness, I believe, can exist when you use small techniques like this. It just feels like this section is just growing and getting bigger, and there's no end to the bigness. Well, technically there is. It's 0 dB. All right, let me play it for you one more time, now that you know where that pitched sound, or that pitched building sound is. So again, it's very subtle, but I believe it's a subtle thing that can make a big difference. And guess what? I didn't waste a lot of audio space in creating that perception of loudness. I allowed my main players, my main instruments, my main sounds to take the prominence that I wanted them to have in order to make this particular section bang in the way that I wanted to bang, right up to 0 dB with that synth and that snare. Hopefully that makes sense. And as I mentioned before, man, we still have some things to cover. So subscribe to the podcast, because now we're going to move into the final mixing stage, into the mastering stage when it comes to volume. And most certainly we'll talk about a few things that will help you get your overall sound way up. So yeah, man, if you want to review our episodes or check out other material that